Hey guys, welcome back. We'll continue with the book Automate the Boring Stuff in Python, and today we're going to learn how to work with CSV files and JSON data. CSV stands for comma-separated values, and CSV files are simplified spreadsheets stored as plain text. JSON, on the other hand, stands for JavaScript Object Notation and is a common format being used to exchange information and is, for example, used by a lot of APIs. Let's start out by looking at the CSV module and how we can work with CSV files. CSV files always have this kind of format where the separate values are separated by comma, which is what CSV stands for, and we basically have a list of the existing data in here. And CSV can then be opened by a lot of different programs, for example by Excel, or also by a lot of text editors, including the Mu code editor. To start out, we're going to work with this example CSV file. You can download this by heading over to this website here, link in the description down below, and here you'll find a link to download the files used in the book. And let's first have a look at how we can read CS file data, and for that we're going to head over to our Mu code editor. And to start working with the CSV module in Python, all we need to do is to type in import CSV. And that's going to import the CSV module into our environment here so we can start working with that. And for now, we're going to start out working in our REPL environment here. So similar as to how we did this when we were working with PDF documents, for example, or Word documents, we are starting out by opening the file. So here in this case, example.csv. Make sure that when you download that resource, you are actually moving it in the Mu code editor folder, which you can access by heading over to users and your username, and there should be a folder called mu_code. And here we need to make sure that we move the example CSV file into this folder. After that, we are using the reader method here, which is part of the CSV module, and we are passing the example file, so the file we opened up here, our CSV file, as an argument to that method. And this is going to return a reader object for us, and we're going to store that in example reader. Now the quickest way to actually access that data from our reader object here is to turn it into a Python list. So we are going to do that by passing example reader to list, and then we are storing that list in example data. And now if we take a look at example data, we can see we have a list now with the different entries in our CSV file. So each sublist here basically includes all the value in our CSV document. If we compare that over here, and we basically extracted that data from our CSV file. And now that we stored the CSV data as a list, we can of course work with it just as with a Python list. So therefore we can go ahead and, for instance, if we want to get the first entry here out of the first list, we can reference our example data list with an index of 0, which is going to give us the first list here inside of the outer list. And then we want to get the first entry out of that. So again, we're passing 0 to it, and that should give us that very first entry here. And in a similar way, of course, we can also access other data points. So for instance, if we want to get back the second entry of the second list here, we can type in example data with index 1. So here, since this is 0 based, we're going to get back the second list. And here we want to have a look at the second entry, which is cherries. And this, of course, is what is returned to us. Now for large CSV files, we quite often want to use our reader object in a for loop to loop through the different entries. And this avoids that we have to load the entire file into memory at once. So let's have a look at an example. We of course first need to import our CSV module, and then we're going to work with the same file as before. So here we're going to call open on example.csv. We're going to store that back in example file. We can use the reader method here, passing the example file as an argument to it, and that reader object is going to be stored in example reader. But now, rather than turning that into a list, we can use a for loop. So here we are looping over all the entries in example reader. And for each row, we're going to print out the row number. Then we print out the line number that we get back from our example reader object. And then we're going to, after a space, add the actual value. So this would be the individual rows in our example reader object. So when we take a look at that, we can see we have row 1 through 7 here. And then we have our different CSV output, just as before, one line at a time printed out here to us. Of course, we can not only read CSV files, but also write them. And for that, we are going to use the writer object. So as before, we need to import our CSV module to start out. And then we're using the open method again, but this time we're not going to open an existing file, but instead we are going to create a new one called output.csv. We need to make sure that we pass w as an additional argument for write. And we also adjust the new line characters to be basically an empty string. Because if you don't do that, we would have double spaces basically, because it defaults to a different newline character. After that, we are using the writer method and we are passing our output file as an argument to it to create a writer object, and that's going to be stored back in output writer. And now we can go ahead and we can use the writeRow method on our writer object here to write lines to our CSV file. So for instance, here we have a new row with 4 separate entries, which are all of course comma separated. And in a similar way, we can write additional rows to it. Let's add a second row and then a third row. And the third row here doesn't contain strings but numbers, so we can also mix and match those. And as a last step, of course, we need to close our file. Now we can open our output CSV file. I'm just using Excel here to open it, and we can see exactly those lines that we wrote to our CSV file are displayed in here. Now if we want to separate our cells with a tab character rather than with a comma, and for example if we want our row to be double spaced, we can use the delimiter and line terminator keyword arguments to make that possible. So to do that, we can go ahead and in our REPL we can first import our CSV module as before, and we're going to create a new file, which in this case is going to end in TSV for tab separated value. We're opening this in write mode because we're creating this new file, and again we are setting the new line to be an empty string. Now we can go ahead and we can use our writer method as before. We pass the CSV file to it just as before, but now we are adding 2 additional keyword arguments. The first one is called delimiter. That's going to default to a comma, which is why we didn't have to use it before. But if we want to have a different delimiter, in this case here a tab character, we need to provide that. So therefore we are typing in \t. And then we are also going to add a line terminator, and we are going to set that to 2 newline characters. By default, we have a single newline character, which is why we had those separate rows in our CSV file. But if we want to have that double spaced, then we can provide 2 \n characters. And just as before, we need to write a couple of rows. So here we are using the write-off method again to write the characters, and what's returned here, by the way, is always the number of characters that have been written to the CSV file. We are also going to add a second row in here, and then a third row. And of course we need to make sure that we actually close our file once we are done. Now when we are opening this file, I'm just using Notepad in this case, we can see that we don't have commas between those values, but instead this is a tab in between those values, and we can see that they are double lined, so we have basically 2 new lines after each row. So if for any reason you want to change those defaulted delimiter and line terminator values, that's possible by providing those keyword arguments. Now if you're working with CSV files that contain header rows, it is often more convenient to work with DictReader and DictWriter rather than the reader and writer objects we've been using so far. We already saw that the reader and writer objects read and write CSV files by using Python lists, and the DictReader and DictWriter CSV objects perform something very similar, but they're using dictionaries instead. So let's work with an example, and we can again have a look at the downloaded resources and make sure that we download the file example with header, which looks like this. We have a timestamp here, fruit and quantity, and again we need to make sure that we move this to our mu directory in order to work with it. And just as before, we need to import our CSV module, and we are then using the open method in order to open our CSV file and storing it back in example file. However, instead of using reader as before, we are now using the DictReader, and we are passing our example file here as an argument to it. Now the return of this dictionary object is then going to be stored in our example DictReader, and now we can go ahead and we can loop over that dictionary object by just using a for loop, and inside of that loop we are going to print out the timestamp, the row which contains the fruit information, and the row that contains the quantity. And of course, in order to reference that, we pass the key to it because we have a dictionary here. So here we can see that data returned to us. So if we compare that to our CSV file, we can see the same data here is returned as in our CSV file, but the header row here was skipped. So we basically were starting with the actual content, and we didn't have to manually remove the header row because that is what the DictReader and also the DictWriter object does for us. Now if we were to use the DictReader object with our example file that we worked with before, which doesn't contain any header, then by default DictReader would actually use the first row here and take the separate entries, for example the timestamp here, then apples, and then 73 as the headers, which is of course not what we want. And therefore we can actually provide some extra arguments when we use DictReader in order to specify a separate header. To do that, we need to import our CSV module, and then of course we need to open our file again. And then we are working with DictReader, we're providing the example file as an argument, but as a second argument we are then providing the header names, in this case time, name and amount. And then we can go ahead just as before and use a for loop to loop over each of the rows in our example DictReader object. And just as before, we are going to print out the different row values for the time, row values for the time, for the name and for the amount row. Let's continue with the project. Let's say we have a lot of CSV files and our job is to remove the first line from those CSV files. So maybe we have a header line there and we need to remove that. We could of course open each file separately, for instance in Excel, and then remove the first row and save the file again, but that would take very long. So instead we're going to write a program to cover that task. And what our program needs to do is to open every single file which has a CSV extension, so which is a CSV file in our current working directory, then needs to read in the contents of the CSV file, and then it needs to rewrite the file with the first row in that file removed. So let's have a look at how we can realize that. And we're going to need our CSV module as before, and also the OS module, because we need to, for instance, create a new directory and also have a look at the specific folders in our working directory. And we are starting out by using the make directory method here, and we're going to create a new directory called header removed, where we are going to add all the CSV files that have their headers removed. Then we need to loop through every file in our current working directory. For that we are going to use the list directory method here, and we are having a look at the current working directory by using the dot notation. And for each file we need to scan if it's actually a CSV file. So if it's ending with .csv, if it does not, this is what this if statement here covers, then we are just going to skip this particular iteration and have a look at the next file. So we're basically looping through every single file and then checking which one of those files is actually a CSV file, and for those we are going to perform some operations. All other files are going to be ignored. To clarify a bit more what we're actually doing, we are then printing out that we're removing the header from a specific CSV file, and then we are reading the CSV file in, and we are skipping the first row. So here we have a list that's empty, CSV rows. We are opening the specific file we are looking at, then we are using reader to read in the specific file and create a reader object, and then we are looping over every single row in that reader object. And if the line number is 1, so if we have the first row, then we are going to skip that particular row, and for all other rows we are appending that row to our list, CSV rows, and ultimately of course we need to close that file. So let's next write our CSV file. For that we are going to open it. We are joining the path here with our directory header removed and the file name. We're going to write it, and we are setting the new line to be an empty character, and this is going to overwrite the files we already have. Then we use writer and pass CSV file object to us as an argument, and this way we are creating a writer object. And then we are looping over each of the rows in our CSV rows list that we created, and we are using the write row method, passing the row as an argument to actually write those rows to the file. And at the end we are then going to close it. And since we skipped the first row here, we're basically overwriting those files, but this time without the first row. So let's run our program, and we can see in this case here we only had 2 CSV files in our directory, so it was removing headers from example.csv and from example with header.csv. And if we then have a look at our directory, you can see we have a new folder header removed, and if we have a look, for example, at example with header, we can see the header has been removed from the file, so it's no longer displayed. Of course, especially if we have a very large number of CSV files, this can save us a lot of time. We can also work with JSON, so with a JavaScript object notation, and for that we are going to work with the Python JSON module. JSON is a really useful way to work with formatted data in a human readable way, and here's a quick example of how data looks like that is formatted as JSON. So we always have those curly braces, then we have a number of key value pairs, and those are separated by a comma. And JSON is really the most frequently used format to work used by APIs, so it's really useful to know how to work with it, especially if we want to exchange data using an API in the future. As we just saw, we can create a new JSON entry in a pretty straightforward way. So here we are defining a new string, so therefore we need to use quotation marks, and inside of that we are using the JSON notation starting with curly braces and then with a number of key value pairs, for example name Sophie and isCat is true, and so on and so forth. And in order to work with our JSON, we need to import our JSON module. In order to translate a string containing JSON data, as we have up here, into a Python value, we need to use a load method, which is part of the JSON module. So therefore we are saying json.loads, and we are passing string of JSON data, so our JSON data up here, as an argument to this method. If we now take a look at the value of JSON data as Python value, so our variable, we can see that indeed we get back this dictionary here, which is our JSON that we translated. So it's just important to remember that we need to use the loads method, which is part of the JSON module, in order to convert JSON as a string to a Python value. We may of course also want to go the opposite way. We may want to convert a Python value to JSON formatted data. For that we would use a different method, specifically the dumps function. So again we have a value here, this time it's a Python dictionary. Of course we need to import our JSON module in order to use it. And then we can use the dumps method, which is also part of the JSON module, and we pass the Python value, so our dictionary, as an argument to it. And that's going to be stored in this case in our strings of JSON data variable. And if we take a look at that again, we can see now we converted it to a string. So the loads and the dumps method basically do the opposite from each other, and we need to remember those two in order to convert a string value to a Python value and vice versa. Now let's have a look at a more complex example, and specifically as a project we are going to fetch the current weather data. And to do that we are actually going to use live data on the internet using the data provided by Open Weather Map. We are going to generate an API key, and then we are going to read the requested location from the command line, download the JSON weather data from our Open Weather Map website, and then we're going to convert the string of JSON data to a Python dictionary, and then we're going to print out the weather for today and for the next couple days. So to start out, we can head over to openweathermap.org, and here you can sign up for an account. We need this account in order to create an API key. And once you've signed up, you can click on your name up here and then click on My API Keys. And this is going to show the API keys. So we need this particular value here. You need to copy it, and we are going to work with it. And then we can get over to our new code editor file and create a new Python file, getopenweather.py. We need to use the app ID, the API key that we created before, and store that in this variable here. So here you need to paste your own API key into this. We need to import the JSON module, the requests module, because we are working with web requests, and also the system module. And then to actually issue the request, we are going to use the command line. Therefore, we are first checking if the length of the argument provided is less than 2. And if it is, then it's not valid. So therefore, we provide some information on how to properly use this. So here we are then giving an example of how that can be used by providing the city name and then the 2-letter country code as command line arguments, and then we exit our program. If that's not the case, so if a valid input is provided, then we are using the join method here to join those command line arguments together and storing them in the location variable. We're then going to download the JSON data from the Open Weather Maps website using the API. So here we need to provide the URL, which is this string here. And then we are going to provide the location as well as the app ID, so the API key we requested before. Next, we are going to use the get method, which is part of the requests module, and we are passing the URL as an argument to it and storing that back in the response variable. And then we are using raise for status to actually see if we get a valid status code. So for instance, if we didn't have a proper internet connection, we would get an error here. We can also, if we'd like, print out the response text to actually see the raw JSON, and then we are going to load the JSON data into a Python variable. As we just learned before, we need to use the loads method here, which is part of the JSON module, and we are passing the response as an argument, specifically the text, and storing that back in the weather data. And then we can go ahead and print the weather's description. So for that we are taking our weather data object, passing a list as a key to it, and then we are printing out the current weather in the location we provided is. And here we are then writing down the different sections of the JSON that we got back from the website using the API, we are going to print out the current weather for today, for the next day, and then for 2 days in the future. And just as a quick note, there seem to be some changes to the API, so we need to adjust the URL here a little bit. Specifically, we want to make sure that we remove that daily section here, as well as the backward slash, and we can change here the query, so we are only going to have the string here and then the app ID, and also make sure that we don't have a space here at the end of the string. And once that is saved, we can head over to our terminal. Let's make sure we are in the right directory here. So in my case, it's under my username and then new_code. And then we can type get_open_weather.py. And if we just provide that name, we're gonna get the error message from before because we need to provide a city name. And I'm just gonna type in Berlin. And this is what we get back. So here we can see all of this up here is actually the JSON we get back. And then specifically we get back current weather, tomorrow's weather, and the day after. And for now, let's actually comment out the response, so we don't always get this entire JSON returned to us. And then we can issue the call again. And for example, let's have a look at the weather in New York City. And here we can see currently it's broken clouds, and that's also what it looks like the next 2 days. And if we take a look at London, for instance, we can see today we have broken clouds, but tomorrow and the day after, they're going to be light rains. So this is just an example, but you can see that we can very easily work with data from the web using the JSON module and then working with various APIs which provide a lot of different data, for instance the weather data. Let's have a look at the practice questions. And the first question is, what are some features Excel spreadsheets have that CSV spreadsheets don't? So a CSV file in general is very simple. In Excel, spreadsheets can have values of data types other than strings. And also cells can be styled in different ways, for example, different sizes, different fonts, different color settings. You can also adjust the width and height of those colors, and you can even merge cells together. All of that is not possible with CSV files. What do you pass to CSV.reader and CSV.writer to create reader and writer objects? So we pass a file object, and we can get that by using the open method. What modes do file objects for reader and writer objects need to be opened in? So file objects need to be open in read binary for reader objects and write binary for writer objects. What method takes a list of arguments and writes it to a CSV file? So for that we would use the writeRow method. What do the delimiter and line terminator keyword arguments do? So the delimiter argument changes the string used to separate cells in a row. And the line terminator argument changes the string used to separate rows. And by default, the line terminator will be set to a simple new line, and the delimiter will be set to a comma value. So if you want to use a different delimiter and line terminator, we need to use those keyword arguments to adjust that accordingly. What function takes a string of JSON data and returns a Python data structure? So that's a loads method, which is part of the JSON module. And we would pass the JSON object as an argument to that method, and is going to return a Python value, so a Python dictionary. What function takes a Python data structure and returns a string of JSON data? So for that we would use the dumps method, which again is part of the JSON module. In this video we covered how to work with CSV files and JSON data, and we saw how we can use that to work, for example, with data on the internet using APIs. In the next video, we'll cover how to keep time, schedule tasks, and launch programs using code. Subscribe to the channel to stay up to date, and see you guys in the next video.